Night of my son's rehearsal dinner, he stood up in front of 60 people, raised his glass, and said the only father he'd ever truly had was sitting at the head table, and it wasn't me. He pointed to his future father-in-law. Everyone applauded. I sat in my chair with my hands folded in my lap and didn't move a muscle. But when they opened my envelope the next morning, everything my son thought he knew about himself fell apart. I need to back up. My name is not important. What matters is that I spent 38 years working for the County Transit Authority in Columbus, Ohio. Bus maintenance, not glamorous work, not the kind of job that gets you invited to charity galas or puts your name in the alumni newsletter. But it was steady, honest work, and it paid for a house on Clement Avenue, 2 cars, and one kid's entire college education. My wife, Loretta, died when our son was 22, pancreatic cancer. 11 months from diagnosis to the end. She never saw him graduate, never met the woman he eventually married, never got the grandchildren she talked about every single evening in the kitchen. I kept going because she would have wanted me to, and because my son, Theo, was worth keeping going for. At least, that's what I believed for a long time. Theo is 34 now. He works in commercial real estate in Cincinnati, drives a BMW, lives in a condo with a view of the Ohio River. I'm proud of what he built. I want that on record. But somewhere between the kid who used to fall asleep on my shoulder watching baseball and the man who stood up at that dinner, something changed in him. Or maybe it was always there and I just refused to see it. It started, the way these things usually do, with a woman. Not that I blame her. Ainsley came from a different world than ours. Her father, Hugh, owned a chain of specialty lumber yards across 3 states. Her mother sat on 2 nonprofit boards and hosted fundraisers in a house that had a name. The Barclays, that's what they called it. The Barclay Estate. I'm not making that up. When Dio brought Ainsley home for Thanksgiving 2 years ago, I made pot roast and opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving. She was polite, gracious even. But I noticed the way her eyes moved across my living room, the way she paused at the fake wood paneling I'd never gotten around to replacing, the way she held her wine glass like she was waiting for the real one to arrive. I didn't say anything. She made Theo happy. That was enough. The engagement happened fast. 6 months later, ring on her finger, venue booked before I even knew he'd proposed. I found out through a text message with a photo attached. I remember sitting with my phone in the kitchen, looking at that diamond and thinking I should call him. I waited for him to call me instead. He didn't, not for 3 days. When he finally came by the house, we sat at the kitchen table the way we always had, and I asked him what the plan was for the wedding. He shifted in his chair the way he used to when he was a teenager trying to avoid a conversation. Hugh's handling most of it, he said. Ainsley's family, you know how they are. I didn't know how they were, but I was starting to learn. The budget, as it was eventually explained to me, was $120,000. He was covering the venue, the catering, the open bar, the photographer, the flowers, the honeymoon, all of it. Because that's what people like Hugh did. They covered things, they made things happen. They didn't sit in the house on Clement Avenue with pot roast and fake wood paneling. Dad, I'd love it if you could handle the rehearsal dinner, Theo said, like he was doing me a favor. Just something nice. 60 people, maybe 65. I looked at my retirement account statement later that night. I had $41,000. Everything I hadn't spent on Loretta's medical bills, everything I'd scraped together over 38 years of early mornings and grease-stained hands. $41,000 and a pension of $1,900 a month. I called a restaurant downtown. Private dining room, 65 guests, 3-course dinner with wine service. The quote came back at $11,000. I said yes without blinking because Theo was my son, and this was the only thing being asked of me, and I was not going to be the one who made it smaller. I spent 2 weeks planning every detail. Centerpieces with Loretta's favorite flowers, white dahlias. A framed photo of Theo as a boy, fishing at Hoover Reservoir the summer before she got sick. A short toast I wrote and rewrote 9 times. I wanted it to feel like something. Like the 34 years of being his father actually meant something in that room. The night arrived. I got to the restaurant 40 minutes early and watched the tables fill with people I mostly didn't know. Ainsley's relatives, her parents' friends, colleagues from Theo's firm. I recognized maybe 8 faces. Hugh was already holding court at the bar when I walked in, laughing at something, comfortable in the way only men with generational money are truly comfortable. He shook my hand warmly, clapped me on the shoulder, told me what a wonderful son I had. I thanked him and reminded myself that this was Theo's night, not mine. Dinner went smoothly. The food was good. The wine kept flowing. I sat at the end of the long table, not the head, because Hugh and his wife had naturally settled there, and no one had rearranged things, and I hadn't wanted to make it awkward. Then Theo stood up. He tapped his glass, and the room went quiet. I straightened in my chair and prepared to feel proud. He talked about Ainsley first, which was right. He talked about the day. He knew she was a one. He talked about the Barkley family, about how welcoming they'd been, about how lucky he was to be joining them. He talked about Hugh specifically, about how Hugh had shown him what it meant to be a real provider, a real partner, a real man. Then he said it. "Hugh," he said, raising his glass toward the head of the table, "you've been more of a father to me in the past year than I thought possible. You're the kind of man I want to become. I mean that." 60 people applauded. I watched Theo smile at Hugh. I watched Hugh nod with that easy confidence of someone who had never doubted his own worth for a single day. I sat with my hands folded, and the $11,000 dinner I'd paid for cooling on the plates around me, and I did not move. The toast I had written and rewritten 9 times stayed in my jacket pocket. After dinner, when people were milling around with coffee, Theo found me near the door. He hugged me and said it was a great dinner, Dad, really great, before someone pulled him away to take a photo. That was the last real conversation we had that night. I drove home on 70 West with the windows down even though it was cold, because I needed the air to think. I didn't sleep. I sat in Loretta's reading chair and looked at the photo on the mantel. Theo at his college graduation, his arm around me, both of us grinning like idiots. He'd said, "I couldn't have done this without you, Dad." I remember the exact weight of his arm on my shoulder. I remember thinking that moment was everything. Had that been real, or I'd have been filling a slot that anyone could have filled, and Hugh Barclay had simply come along with better credentials. I went to the kitchen and opened the folder where I kept the important papers: birth certificate, adoption certificate. Yes, adoption. Loretta and I had tried for years. After the 3rd miscarriage, the doctor used words I don't want to repeat. We grieved that for a long time, the two of us, quietly, in the way that couples do when the thing they wanted most turns out to be the one thing they can't have. Then a social worker named Patricia, who Loretta knew from church, called us on a Wednesday afternoon in March and asked if we'd be interested in a little boy, almost 2 years old, whose mother had died suddenly of an aneurysm and whose father had surrendered parental rights rather than raise him alone. We drove to the county office the next morning. Theo was sitting on a rug in the middle of the intake room, carefully stacking foam blocks. He looked up at us and didn't cry. He just looked. Loretta knelt down and held out her hand, and he put one of his foam blocks in it like he was giving her a gift. We brought him home 4 months later after every form was filed, and every home study was passed, and every box was checked. We never told him. We talked about telling him when he was old enough, then older, then we kept finding reasons to wait. Loretta worried it would make him feel unwanted. I worried it would unravel something we'd spent years carefully building. We made the wrong choice in the wrong direction for too long. I know that now. But I also know this. Not one day of loving that boy was anything less than real. I sat at the kitchen table with the adoption certificate in my hands for a long time. I thought about what Loretta would say. I thought about Theo at that dinner, raising his glass toward a man he'd known for 18 months, saying the words I had waited 34 years to earn. I thought about the envelope I'd planned to give him at the wedding. Originally, it was going to be a check for $8,000, everything I could spare, tucked inside a handwritten letter about his mother, about the fishing trip at Hoover Reservoir, about what it meant to watch someone grow from a frightened 2-year-old into a man. I went to my desk and I started writing a different letter. The wedding was at the Barkley estate on a Saturday in October. 200 guests. A white tent on the lawn with chandeliers. Past appetizers that probably cost more per piece than my grocery budget for a week. I wore my dark gray suit, the one I'd bought for Loretta's funeral and worn to every important occasion since, because it was the only suit I owned that still fit properly. Theo had given me a specific arrival time. 2 o'clock. The ceremony starts at 2:30. Don't be late. I had it written in my calendar. I had it set as an alarm on my phone. I parked at 1:45 in the overflow lot by the service road and walked toward the tent. The ceremony had already started. I could hear the minister's voice carrying across the lawn, the formal cadence of wedding vows drifting through the October air. I stopped walking. I checked my phone. 1:48. I pulled out the printed email Theo had sent with the wedding details. Ceremony 2:30 p.m. A man in a suit who I recognized vaguely as one of Ainsley's cousins was hurrying past me toward the tent, glancing at his watch. "We're late," his wife said, pulling at his arm. "It started at 1. 1 o'clock, not 2:30. I stood on the gravel path between rows of parked Range Rovers and Mercedes sedans, and I looked at my email again and I understood. The time had been changed, or rather, the time on my copy had been changed. Because I wasn't supposed to be there for the ceremony. I wasn't supposed to walk my son down the aisle, wasn't supposed to be seated in the front row, wasn't supposed to occupy any space in the moment that would be photographed and framed and looked at for decades. I was supposed to arrive at a wedding already in progress and find a seat somewhere in the back like a late guest who hadn't planned properly. I stood there for a moment. The October air smelled like cut grass and wood smoke. Through the tent walls, I could see the glow of those chandeliers, the silhouettes of 200 people witnessing my son begin his new life, a life in which I had apparently been quietly, carefully repositioned to the margins. I found a bench near the parking area and I sat down. I didn't leave. That's important. I almost left. I sat there for 20 minutes with my hands on my knees, thinking about driving back to Columbus and never returning a call again. But I didn't, because in my jacket pocket was the envelope, and the envelope was the reason I had come. The ceremony ended. Music started from inside the tent. Guests began moving from the ceremony space toward the reception, filing past me with champagne flutes, their faces flushed with the particular happiness of people who have witnessed a good wedding on a beautiful day. I joined the flow. Nobody noticed me particularly. I was just an older man in a gray suit moving with the crowd. I found the reception tent, found the gift table, found a moment when Theo was occupied with the photographer across the room. I set the envelope down among the other gifts, plain white, his name in my handwriting on the front. Then I found a standing spot near the edge of the tent, and I waited. The toasts came after dinner. Best man first, then maid of honor, then Hugh, who spoke for 12 minutes with the confidence of a man who had given many speeches in many tents and knew exactly how to work a room. He called Ainsley his masterpiece. He called Theo the son he'd always hoped she would choose. He made people laugh, made people tear up, and sat down to a standing ovation. Then Ainsley spoke. She thanked her parents, thanked the guests, thanked Theo's father. She looked directly at Hugh when she said it. Then Theo stood up. I don't need to reconstruct the whole speech. What matters is the part near the end, when he turned toward you again and said, I spent a lot of my life looking for the kind of man I wanted to become. And I found him when I found this family. Hugh, you showed me what a father actually looks like. People applauded. Someone near me made a small sound of delight. I looked at the gift table from across the room. My envelope was still there, sandwiched between a silver-wrapped box and something in a Tiffany bag. I set down my champagne glass. I did not leave dramatically. I didn't let my face do anything particular. I simply walked toward the exit the way a man walks when he needs some air, unhurried, unremarkable. I passed through the tent flap and out into the dark October night. I sat in my truck for a while. The music from inside was muffled but audible, something with a beat that meant people were dancing. My son was dancing at his wedding. That was a good thing. I held on to that. Then I drove home. The calls started the next afternoon. I was in the backyard raking leaves when my phone buzzed on the porch railing. Theo, I let it go. It buzzed again 15 minutes later. Then again. By the time I came inside, there were 4 missed calls and a voicemail that I played while standing at the kitchen sink. Dad. His voice was different, tight in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. Caught in a lie. Call me back as soon as you get this. It's important. I put the phone down and finished making dinner. The next voicemail arrived an hour later. Dad, I read your letter. I need you to explain this. Please call me. Then, Dad, is this real? Is any of this real? Who? He stopped, started again. I need to talk to you. Please. Then, near midnight, his voice breaking in a way that did something to my chest I can't fully describe. Dad, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't Mom tell me? I need to know where I came from. I need to know where I came from. I need to know who I am. Please just pick up the phone. I sat in Loretta's chair and listened to every message twice. There were 11 of them by the time I went to bed. The letter had told him everything. About the social worker named Patricia, about the county intake office and the phone blocks, about his mother who died of an aneurysm when he was 22 months old, and his biological father who signed the paperwork and walked away. About how Loretta and I had driven down on a Wednesday morning and watched a little boy hand a woman he'd never met one of his phone blocks like it was the most natural thing in the world. It also told him about the rehearsal dinner toast, about the change ceremony time, about all of it. Not with anger, just with facts, laid out quietly, the way a man lays out facts when he has nothing left to hide and nothing left to lose. And at the end, it said this, I am not telling you this to hurt you. I am telling you because you stood in front of 60 people and said Hugh Barclay was more of a father to you than I had been, and I realized you had built your whole idea of fatherhood on what you could see and measure and compare. Money, access, connections. I understand why those things look like love when you grow up without enough of them, but they are not the same thing. Your mother and I chose you when we had nothing to offer but ourselves. I need you to know that. I need you to sit with the difference. I didn't answer the phone that week. I went about my routines, coffee in the morning, the newspaper, an hour of work in the backyard now that the leaves were coming down in force. My neighbor, a retired teacher named Archie, came over Wednesday afternoon and we watched the game without saying much. That was enough. I thought about Theo constantly. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. I thought about him the way you think about a tooth you've just had pulled, the space where it was, the way everything around it feels, the absence. I thought about the phone blocks, about Loretta kneeling on that floor with her hand out, about 18 years of school lunches and Little League games and one very long night in a hospital waiting room when he was 16 and had wrapped his car around a guardrail on 315 and I sat in a plastic chair for 4 hours, not knowing. I thought about whether I'd done the right thing, telling him the way I had, in that envelope, at that moment. I still don't know. Probably there were better ways. There usually are in hindsight. But I also knew what I was protecting by telling him then, at that moment, in that place. Not myself. I was protecting the truth of what Loretta and I had done, which was choose a child who had been left behind and give him a name and a home and everything we had, without any guarantee he'd ever understand the weight of it. That deserved to be known. Whatever happened next, it deserved to be known. Theo called on a Saturday, 11 days after the wedding. I was in the kitchen, and I picked up. There was a long silence before he spoke. Then, I've been talking to a therapist, he said. She thinks I should come see you. Do you think you should come see you? I said. Another silence. Yeah, he said. I think I do. He came the following Sunday. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he told me Hugh was handling the wedding, and he looked older than 34. He looked like a man who had spent 11 days finding out that the ground under his life was different than he'd thought. I made coffee. I didn't rush anything. He asked about his biological parents. I told him what I knew, which wasn't much. The social worker's notes, the dates, the cause of death, the name on the paperwork. I told him there were ways to find out more if he wanted. I told him that was entirely his choice, and whatever he found, it would not change anything about what the three of us had been. He cried at some point. I didn't stop him. He apologized for the rehearsal dinner. He said he hadn't realized how it sounded, which I didn't entirely believe, but also didn't push. Because we were both tired, and the day was long, and some things take longer than one Sunday afternoon to fully account for. When he left, he hugged me in the doorway longer than he had in years. the way he used to when he was small. I stood there and let it happen, and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything that needed to be said right then. He drove away, and I stood on the porch in the November cold for a while, watching his taillights disappear down Clement Avenue. I don't know what comes next. I mean that plainly. I don't know how much ground we can recover, or whether recovery is even the right word for what two people do when they finally stop pretending. I know he still has a wife who comes from a family with a house that has a name. I know Hugh Barkley isn't going anywhere. I know that Theo will spend the rest of his life holding two different stories about where he came from, and trying to make them fit together, which is hard work, and not something I can do for him. But I know is this: I am 67 years old. I have a house on Clement Avenue with paint that needs touching up and gutters that sag on the east side. I have a pension and a reading chair that still smells faintly like the woman I loved for 31 years. I have a photo on my mantle of a 2-year-old boy handing my wife a foam block, which I took out of the album and framed after Loretta died because I wanted to see it every day. I am not a failure. I never was. It just took a long time and a plain white envelope to make that clear to both of us. I keep coming back to that image of Theo in the county intake room, carefully stacking foam blocks. 2 years old, already left behind once, sitting on a rug in a government building with fluorescent lights and linoleum floors. And when Loretta knelt down and held out her hand, he didn't reach for her. He placed a foam block in her palm, like a gift, like he was giving her something instead of the other way around. I've thought about that moment 1,000 times, over 34 years, and I've thought about it differently since October, because what that little boy did, offering something to a stranger, unprompted, with no guarantee of what came back, that was character. Not learned character, not performed character. Something already there at 2 years old, before the world had a real chance to shape it either way. I wonder sometimes where it went, or whether it went anywhere at all, and I just stopped being able to see it clearly because I was too close. Here is what I know about how things tend to work out. At least in my experience, people don't get away with much for very long. Not because the universe keeps score in any tidy way, but because the choices we make accumulate. They pile up quietly, the way leaves do in the gutters of a house nobody's paying attention to, until the weight of them becomes visible. Theo spent a year choosing access over history, choosing the appearance of a better father over the substance of the one he had. That's a real choice with real weight. The envelope didn't punish him. It just made the weight visible all at once. What strikes me more, looking back, is how long I waited. Not out of weakness. I want to be clear about that. I waited because I was trying to be decent. Because I kept asking myself what Loretta would have wanted, and she always wanted peace. But there's a version of decency that curls in on itself and becomes something closer to erasure. I let myself be made smaller and smaller, and I kept calling it love, when really some of it was just fear. Fear of the confrontation. Fear of losing what little I still had with him. It took 38 years of bus maintenance to understand this, but the most useful thing a person can do when they've been quietly wronged is to remain clear-eyed about it. Not bitter, not performative, not cruel, just honest. The letter I wrote wasn't revenge. It was honesty that had been deferred long past its due date. What I hope Theo takes from all of this, and what I'm still working out myself, is a difference between intelligence and wisdom. He's a smart man. He reads rooms, closes deals, moves through the world with a kind of social fluency I never had. But smart isn't the same as knowing what actually matters, and it isn't the same as having the backbone to act on what matters when it costs you something. Hugh could write a check for $120,000 without feeling it. What he could not do, and will never be able to do, is sit in a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m. because a 16-year-old drove too fast on a wet road. That kind of staying, that's the thing you can't buy and can't fake and can't replace with access to better venues. I'm 67 years old. I have maybe 20 years left if I'm lucky, less if I'm not. And I've decided that whatever time remains belongs to me in a way it hasn't for a long time. That's not a declaration of coldness. It's just the recognition that a man who gives everything he has to people who measure him against wealthier alternatives hasn't been generous. He's been careless with himself. Loretta would have said it more gently, but she would have said it. Theo and I are finding our way back, slowly. Sundays at the kitchen table again. Longer silences than we used to have, but more honest ones. The phone block is still on the mantel, right next to her photograph.